Welcome to Sleepy Tales, where relaxing stories are told slowly and softly to help you gently fall asleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. For more peaceful tales, subscribe and hit the bell to stay updated. Now, get comfortable and drift off to tonight's bedtime story. There once was a nightingale whose song stirred the heart more deeply than any treasure found in an emperor's palace. It was a song that did not seek applause, yet it changed those who listened. This story travels into that quiet space where beauty lives unnoticed until the world grows desperate for it. It follows the path from wonder to forgetfulness, from imitation to truth, and from the glitter of illusions to the simple, steady glow of something real. As the palace grows louder, the voice of the nightingale grows softer, and the fate of an emperor begins to depend on which one the world decides to hear. This is a tale about the cost of neglecting what is alive and the strange comfort of what is not, and how one fragile song can carry a kingdom through darkness. The emperor's kingdom stretched so far that even the most skilled mapmakers struggled to capture its true size. Mountains marked its distant borders, and long rivers curled across the land like silver threads. Villages, towns, and cities sat along these waters, filled with people who took pride in the greatness of their ruler. Everywhere one looked, there were signs of beauty and perfection, because nothing in the kingdom felt complete unless it shone brightly enough to reflect the emperor's pride. The palace at the heart of the land rose above everything else, with walls built of smooth stone and gardens designed with such careful detail that even the smallest flower seemed placed with intention. It was a place where everything existed to impress, and nothing was left to chance. The emperor believed that all wonders of the world lived within his palace grounds. He collected jewels from faraway lands, paintings that captured scenes he had never seen in person, and silks dyed in colors richer than the sunsets over his kingdom. Each room in the palace carried a different theme, either to showcase a rare treasure or to highlight the skills of artisans who had worked tirelessly to create something worthy of being seen by his royal eyes. Visitors from distant countries were guided through long hallways and open courtyards, each one designed to take their breath away. And whenever the emperor noticed their awe, he felt certain that nothing could surpass his collection. But the truth was that beauty also lived beyond the palace walls, untouched by the emperor's hands and unmeasured by the standards of his court. A forest lay just outside the edge of the gardens, separated only by a thin stream and a line of stones. Most people at the palace rarely crossed into it, believing it held nothing of value. It was simple and quiet, with tall trees that swayed gently in the wind and moss-covered paths that softened footsteps. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft shapes, and wildflowers grew in patches, unnoticed by anyone except the creatures who lived among them. It was a world so peaceful and humble that it rarely drew attention. Yet in this quiet place lived the nightingale, a small bird easily overlooked by anyone passing by. Its feathers were plain, and its size was nothing special. There was no bright color to catch the eye, no unusual shape to make people pause. But when the bird opened its wings and began to sing, the forest transformed. Its song carried a clarity that seemed to touch the heart directly. The sound moved through the trees like a soft breeze, lifting the air with each delicate note. Animals paused to listen. Leaves shivered as if stirred by the melody. The forest became a different world whenever the nightingale sang, as though something sacred had awakened. Travelers who wandered through the forest during their journeys often stopped in wonder the moment they heard the song. Many had traveled across continents, seen palaces, climbed mountains, and crossed deserts. Yet nothing compared to the pure, effortless beauty of the nightingale's voice. Scholars, poets, and philosophers returned home speaking of the extraordinary bird hidden deep in the emperor's land. They described the song in their writings, telling stories about the way it brought tears to even the most hardened listeners. Some said it reminded them of memories long forgotten. Others said it felt like a promise of peace. And still, others believed the song had the power to heal the quiet sorrows that lived inside the human spirit. As these stories spread, the nightingale became famous in faraway places, long before anyone in the palace had heard its name. Travelers wrote letters that praised the bird with such passion that people who had never seen the kingdom now wished to visit only to hear the song themselves. It became a secret treasure, known to everyone except those who lived closest to it. And because the palace officials never ventured into the simple forest, they remained unaware of the precious jewel resting just a short walk away. Inside the palace, life continued in its usual pattern of ceremony and display. Musicians played songs created by the finest composers, and dancers performed in grand halls lit by hundreds of lanterns. Every performance was carefully rehearsed, every movement polished to perfection. Attendants hurried from room to room carrying fresh flowers, while caretakers brushed dust from delicate porcelain pieces imported from distant lands. The palace shone brighter than ever, each day filled with noise, formality, and admiration. No one imagined that something greater than all of this existed just beyond the garden walls. One day, a traveler arrived at court and began to admire the palace, just as many visitors did. However, instead of praising the jewels or the gardens, this traveler mentioned the nightingale. He spoke of its voice with such deep respect that it surprised everyone listening. He described how its song rose above the sound of the wind and settled into the deepest part of the human heart. The officials stared at him, puzzled, for they had no idea what bird he spoke of. They prided themselves on knowing every treasure the emperor possessed. Yet this one seemed to have escaped their notice entirely. Soon, other travelers confirmed the same story. Letters arrived containing poems inspired by the nightingale's voice. Scholars praised it in their works. Even distant rulers, who had never stepped foot in the kingdom, sent messages expressing envy that such a miracle lived so close to the emperor's palace. Slowly, the palace officials began to feel embarrassed. How could the whole world know of a wonder found within their own land when they themselves had never heard it? Their pride felt shaken, and their confidence in their knowledge weakened. Whispers spread through the halls, and soon the emperor heard of the bird. He listened with growing curiosity as his attendants repeated the travelers' stories. The idea that something so beautiful lived near his palace yet remained unknown to him, stirred a feeling he rarely experienced: uncertainty. If such a treasure existed, he believed it must belong to him, or at least be celebrated under his rule. The thought that it lived freely in a simple forest beyond his control felt almost impossible to accept. Without even hearing its song, he began to imagine the nightingale as another jewel, waiting to be added to his collection. This desire grew stronger each day as more stories arrived. Some said the nightingale's song sounded like the purest crystal. Others said it held the softness of moonlight. Some claimed its music rose and fell like waves on a distant shore. Each new description painted the bird as something extraordinary, something the emperor should have known about all along. The palace, with all its wealth and beauty, suddenly felt incomplete. A quiet emptiness began to form, shaped by something the emperor had never seen or heard, but now deeply wanted. And so, the search for the nightingale began. Servants and officials prepared to enter the forest for the first time in many years, feeling both determined and uneasy. They expected to find a bird as magnificent in appearance as the stories described in sound. They imagined rare colors, shimmering feathers, or a creature unlike any they had seen before. The forest, which had always been ignored, now became a place of interest. But while they prepared, the nightingale continued to sing in its quiet home, unaware of the great change coming its way, a change that would soon transform not only its own life, but the life of the emperor himself. And as the forest listened to the gentle notes rising from the small bird perched among the leaves, the palace prepared for something it had never truly understood. Something living, something free, and something far more delicate than any treasure it had ever held. Once the emperor learned that the nightingale lived so close to his palace, he became filled with a restless longing. He imagined its song filling his grand halls, echoing through chambers lined with silk, and rising above the sound of fountains in his gardens. The idea of owning such a marvel grew in his mind until it overshadowed every other thought. He could not understand how something so precious had been allowed to remain hidden for so long. His desire sharpened into a command, and everyone in the palace felt the urgency of his wish. The order spread quickly. The nightingale must be found and brought to the palace at once. Attendants rushed to the forest with a blend of fear and determination. They carried lanterns even though the sun still hung in the sky, as if expecting the light to reveal something more extraordinary than the bird itself. They stepped carefully between trees, pushing aside branches and listening for any sound that resembled the beauty described by travelers. The forest, which had always been quiet and unnoticed, now trembled with the presence of so many unfamiliar footsteps. It was as though a peaceful world, long protected by solitude, was suddenly exposed to curious eyes and hurried hands. Deep within the forest, the nightingale continued its simple routine, unaware of the excitement growing in the palace. The bird lived freely, resting on branches that swayed gently beneath it, and singing when it felt the moment was right. Its song drifted peacefully across the forest floor, bringing calm to small animals and lifting the heavy air of afternoon. But when the attendants reached the place where the sound flowed through the trees, they stopped, overwhelmed by the very beauty they had come to capture. They listened with wide eyes and unsteady hearts, realizing at last that the travelers had not exaggerated. This small bird carried a power none of them could have imagined. Although the attendants admired the nightingale's song, they also feared returning to the palace without fulfilling the emperor's command. And so, with careful hands, they moved closer, hoping not to startle the bird. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the nightingale was taken from its branch. The moment was quiet, yet it carried the weight of something lost. The trees, the breeze, and even the sunlight felt different as the attendants carried the bird away. A small tremble of silence followed them, as though the forest knew a piece of its soul had been carried toward a world that did not understand it. When the nightingale entered the palace, everything changed at once. The bird was placed in a large room, decorated with gold and filled with objects that sparkled in the afternoon light. Servants gathered around, staring with admiration that grew with every soft breath the bird took. Musicians studied its tiny shape as if expecting inspiration to leap out of its feathers. Poets sat along the walls, imagining new verses inspired by this living creature. The palace, which had often prided itself on beauty, crafted by human hands, now believed it possessed something even greater, something natural, rare, and alive. But this admiration felt different from the reverence shown by travelers in the forest. Instead of listening in humble silence, the palace expected the nightingale to perform. Instead of appreciating the freedom that made the bird's song so magical, the court saw it as a jewel to display. The nightingale was placed on a silk cushion, surrounded by lanterns that glowed brightly no matter the time of day. Servants brought fresh flowers to decorate the room, believing the bird needed beauty as much as they did. But what the nightingale needed most, open branches, cool shadows, and the gentle stir of wind through leaves, was nowhere to be found. Still, the nightingale sang. Its voice, though touched by confusion, carried the same purity that had enchanted travelers in the forest. The court froze whenever it began, overcome by the sound. The emperor himself listened with pride, believing he had claimed something no other ruler possessed. He saw the bird as a symbol of his greatness, another treasure to add to his collection. He imagined foreign visitors envying him once they heard the song inside his palace walls. In his mind, the nightingale now belonged to him, and its purpose was to serve his desire for beauty. But the palace did not understand the cost of such admiration. The nightingale's world had once been filled with space and silence, where every note it sang blended naturally with the living landscape around it. In the palace, its song echoed against walls that did not breathe. The air felt heavy, filled with perfumes and decorations that offered no comfort. The bright lights pressed too close, and the constant attention felt like a cage, even though no bars surrounded it. The bird sang because it was expected to, not because the forest stirred its heart. Day after day, the court praised the nightingale, calling it a miracle, a jewel, a divine wonder. But with every word of admiration, they added another invisible thread of expectation that wrapped tightly around the bird. They wanted the same song again and again, believing the nightingale could not change or grow tired. They did not see how its feathers seemed less vibrant, or how its breaths sometimes shook with quiet exhaustion. They did not notice how its pauses grew longer or how its wings twitched, as if longing for something far away. The emperor, amused by the court's fascination, arranged gatherings where the nightingale would sing. Musicians played their instruments afterward, trying to match the purity of its notes. But the calm spirit of the forest could not be reproduced. Visitors bowed their heads in awe, believing the palace had found the greatest treasure in the world. And through it all, the bird grew weaker, though no one recognized the change. The nightingale's heart carried the memory of cool branches and soft shadows, but those memories began to feel distant. The palace's admiration, though full of praise, weighed heavily upon the bird. Its song lost some of its natural ease, though most listeners were too distracted by their own excitement to notice. Only the forest, now strangely quiet, seemed aware of the emptiness left behind. The air did not carry the same life. The paths felt less welcoming. Even the animals sensed the change, moving more slowly through the undergrowth, as though searching for a sound that no longer came. There were nights when the nightingale tried to rest, but the palace never fully slept. Footsteps echoed in distant halls, lanterns flickered endlessly, and voices drifted through the walls. The bird felt as though the calm rhythm of the forest had been replaced with a restless heartbeat it could not escape. Its wings felt heavier, as if the air around it no longer knew how to lift them. Though it continued to sing, the beauty now came with effort, like a flame trying to survive in heavy wind. Words of admiration continued to pour in from distant places. Letters arrived at the palace, praising the emperor for possessing such a treasure. Scholars wrote about the bird as though it were an object of study, not a living being. Those who visited the forest seeking the nightingale returned disappointed, unaware that its absence was a loss felt deeply by the land itself. The emperor, pleased by the attention, believed that the nightingale's place in the palace was perfect. But deep inside, the bird felt a quiet ache growing. Its longing for the forest grew stronger each day, spreading through its body like a soft but persistent whisper. The palace had become an ornate cage, wrapped in gold and praise, yet lacking the simple freedom that once allowed its song to rise effortlessly. This ache would soon push the bird toward a decision that would change the palace forever. And far beyond the palace walls, something new was already making its way toward the emperor. A creation of jewels and gears crafted by human hands, promising a beauty without burden and a song without life. Soon, the nightingale would no longer be the only marvel in the palace. The day the mechanical nightingale arrived at the palace, excitement swept through every hall like a sudden glittering wind. It was sent by a distant emperor, accompanied by messengers who carried it with great care, as though it were a sacred treasure. The box that held it was lined with silk, and when the lid was lifted, gasps filled the room. There it stood, a jeweled bird shaped with such precision that every feather seemed carved from precious metal. Its wings shimmered with tiny gemstones, and its eyes sparkled with a cold, perfect shine. It was everything the palace loved, bright, delicate, expensive, and crafted for admiration. Servants carried it into the grand hall, where most wonders of the palace were displayed. Musicians gathered around it, studying its form with curiosity. Artisans examined the fine details, amazed at the skill required to create something so intricate. Scholars whispered about the mechanics hidden within its body, guessing how gears and springs might work together to produce sound. The emperor watched with growing delight, already imagining how the jeweled bird would impress visitors from distant lands. It was a treasure that reflected his wealth and the reach of his influence, for only the greatest rulers exchanged gifts of such value. When the mechanism was wound for the first time, a small sound clicked within the bird's body. Then the music began. The song rose into the air, clear and bright, each note perfectly shaped and perfectly timed. It echoed through the hall with a precision that amazed everyone present. The musicians listened in awe, marveling at how clean and flawless the melody sounded. The bird's beak opened and closed with each note, and its wings moved in gentle patterns, sparkling under the lantern light. The court stared at the mechanical marvel, as though nothing in the world could rival its beauty. Whispers spread quickly. People praised the new bird for its consistent song, its sparkling feathers, and the way it never tired. Unlike the real nightingale, the mechanical one could sing the same tune endlessly, always with the same strength and clarity. There were no pauses, no moments of stillness, no signs of emotion or fatigue. It simply performed whenever someone wound the key, filling the palace with a familiar melody that demanded no understanding of nature or heart. It was perfect in the way the court understood perfection, predictable, controlled, and adorned with jewels. Slowly, the attention that had once surrounded the real nightingale shifted toward the artificial one. The court became fascinated by the idea of beauty that required no care. They admired the mechanical bird's reliability, its ability to perform without hesitation. They enjoyed knowing exactly what to expect each time it sang. They praised its creators, calling them geniuses capable of crafting something equal to or even greater than nature. With every performance, they grew more enchanted with the glittering imitation. In the midst of this excitement, the real nightingale stood quietly near a window, unnoticed by most of the court. Its feathers looked plain beside the jeweled wings of the mechanical bird. Its soft breathing seemed almost invisible in a room filled with clicking gears and polished metal. As the artificial melody filled the hall, the nightingale felt a deep ache that spread through its small body. It recognized that the palace no longer heard its song. The beauty it offered, shaped by the forest and carried by its living heart, had been replaced by the cold shine of a crafted tune. The nightingale did not understand the ways of the palace, nor the values of those who lived within it, but it understood silence, the kind that grows when admiration fades. It understood longing, the kind that stirs when the heart feels out of place. It understood the difference between living freely and being displayed as a treasure. And now, standing within walls too bright and air too heavy, it understood that the song it carried no longer had a place here. Quietly, the nightingale opened its wings. The window beside it was left unlatched, perhaps by accident, perhaps by chance. A breeze drifted through it, carrying the faint scent of leaves and earth. That small breath of forest air reached the bird and awakened something deep within it, a memory of freedom. a reminder of what its voice once sounded like when the wind shaped the melody. Without hesitation, without fear, the nightingale lifted itself into the air and slipped through the opening. No one noticed the moment it left. All eyes remained fixed on the mechanical marvel. All ears stayed tuned to the predictable notes of the artificial song. The nightingale flew into the sky, its wings trembling with both weakness and relief. The palace shrank behind it, disappearing beneath layers of smoke, light, and distance. Ahead stretched the forest, waiting silently like an old friend. When the nightingale reached the trees, the forest stirred as though awakening from a deep sleep. The branches trembled softly, and the wind shifted, carrying the bird's scent and guiding it toward familiar paths. The nightingale landed on a quiet branch and rested, overwhelmed by the comfort of being home. It did not sing at first. It needed time to breathe the forest air again, to let silence wrap around it without expectation or command. The forest accepted it without question, offering shade and stillness instead of applause. Meanwhile, in the palace, the mechanical nightingale became the center of attention. The emperor ordered it to be placed on a high pedestal, surrounded by gold and silk. Servants polished its jeweled feathers daily until they gleamed. Scholars studied its mechanism closely, believing it held secrets worth understanding. Every evening, someone wound the key, and the bird's song filled the great hall with flawless notes that never changed. At first, the court felt proud. They admired the mechanical marvel's consistency and praised its beauty. They no longer thought about the real nightingale, except perhaps to remember that it had once lived there and sung songs that sounded lovely but unpredictable. They believed the artificial bird to be superior because it fit their world more naturally, controlled, manageable, and unchanging. But as weeks passed, something subtle began to shift. The mechanical nightingale's song, though perfect, never surprised them. It never rose or fell with emotion. It never carried the softness of dawn or the sadness of twilight. It never sounded different from one day to the next. People could predict every note before it came. At first, this familiarity comforted them. But slowly, the comfort faded into dullness. The melody repeated so often that it began to blend into the background of palace life. It no longer stirred anyone's heart. It simply existed, like the sound of a clock ticking in a quiet room. Visitors who had heard about the marvel came to see it, only to leave with polite but distant expressions. They admired its craftsmanship, but the admiration ended there. The court tried to rekindle excitement by adding new decorations around the pedestal or arranging special gatherings. But the mechanical bird never offered more than what it had already given. Its perfection had no depth. Its reliability had no life. Meanwhile, the forest slowly regained a sense of balance it had lost. Though the nightingale remained quiet at first, its presence alone filled the forest with a feeling of peace. The animals sensed it and moved more freely. The air felt lighter. The sunlight seemed warmer as it filtered through the leaves. But even though the forest welcomed the nightingale home, it also understood that the bird had not yet healed completely. There was a weight still clinging to its heart, shaped by captivity and the memory of a world that had praised it without understanding its nature. Back in the palace, the mechanical bird continued its steady performance. But as time went on, the mechanism inside it grew tired. The gears that once moved smoothly began to click with faint strain. Tiny movements became less fluid. The jeweled wings lost a bit of their shimmer. The song, though still clear, began to sound thinner, as though something inside the machine was wearing down. Those who cared for the bird noticed these small changes, but dismissed them, believing it was impossible for such a fine creation to weaken. They continued to wind the key day after day, unaware that the bird's body held limits that were slowly approaching. The palace carried on with its artificial beauty, unaware of the silence gathering outside the mechanical melody. The forest carried on with its quiet healing, unaware of the palace's growing emptiness. But soon, one of these worlds would change again, shaken by events neither could avoid. Time passed quietly in the palace after the real Nightingale fled back to the forest. The court continued to rely on the jeweled mechanical bird for music, winding its key every morning and every evening, as though the predictable melody could replace the living wonder they had once possessed. For a while, the carefully crafted notes still rose into the air, bright and polished as always. The mechanical wings lifted and fell with a delicate charm that impressed visitors. But inside its jeweled body, thin wires and tiny gears began to strain under the constant use. The palace never noticed the early signs of weakness. They believed the machine invincible because it was made from fine metals and expensive stones. They did not imagine that something without life could become exhausted just as a living creature could. So they wound the key again and again, expecting the same performance each time. The mechanical bird obeyed, its movements slightly stiffer, its song a little thinner. The change was too subtle at first, hidden beneath the echo of the familiar tune. Then, one evening, during a gathering meant to impress a group of honored guests, the mechanical nightingale released a soft click that sounded sharper than usual. Its head tilted in an unnatural angle, and the melody faltered for the first time since its arrival. The notes stretched unevenly, as though the gears inside were struggling against time. Then suddenly, with a final harsh snap, the music stopped completely. The jeweled wings froze in mid-motion. The beak remained parted, as if caught between breaths. And silence, deep and heavy, filled the great hall. The guests waited, expecting the bird to simply resume its song. Servants rushed forward to wind the key again, but the mechanism refused to move. They tried gently at first, then with growing panic, but the key would not turn. The palace musicians examined it, but their hands shook as they realized the gears were jammed beyond repair. Scholars studied the bird with worried expressions, searching for hidden switches or delicate ways to open its body. Artisans brought tools, attempting to study the mechanism, but nothing responded. The bird had sung its final tune. The emperor was informed immediately. His disappointment struck the court like a winter wind. The mechanical marvel had become more than an object to him. It had become a symbol of his power, his taste, and his ability to command beauty. Now it sat motionless and silent. The emperor ordered the finest mechanics from every corner of the empire to come to the palace and examine the device. They arrived with tools, knowledge, and great caution. But the more they studied, the more they realized that the bird's delicate parts were worn down beyond recovery. The gears had ground together for too long. The wires had stretched in ways that could not be undone. No amount of skill or wealth could bring its song back. The emperor felt the loss deeply. Silence filled the palace in a way it never had before. Without music, the grand halls felt colder, as though the air itself had forgotten how to move. The fountains sounded too loud. Footsteps echoed as if they carried sorrow. Even the lantern light appeared weaker, unable to warm the empty spaces left by the missing melody. The emperor walked through his palace with a heavy heart, feeling a strange emptiness he could not name. Not long after the mechanical bird broke, the emperor fell ill. It began with a weakness in his limbs and a heaviness in his chest. His steps grew slower with each passing day, and he spent more time resting in his chambers. Doctors arrived with remedies and advice, but nothing eased his discomfort. Soon, the emperor found himself confined to his grand bed, surrounded by thick curtains and dim light. The palace continued its daily routines, but everything moved quietly, as though trying not to disturb the air around the sick ruler. The emperor lay in his bed, feeling the vast emptiness of his palace pressing against him. The silence that filled his chambers felt almost alive, gathering like shadows around his bedposts and stretching across the floor. At night, when the lanterns flickered softly, the silence grew even deeper. The emperor felt as though something heavy rested on his chest, pulling him toward a darker place where breath came slowly and thoughts drifted like fading smoke. He sensed the presence of the mechanical bird somewhere nearby, not through its song, but through the memory of it, motionless, broken, and silent. As his illness worsened, the emperor became aware of something else in the room. It was not a person or a sound, but a feeling, cold, steady, and patient. The shadows near the curtains seemed to move closer each night, settling around him like a quiet fog. The emperor realized that he was standing on the edge of something he could not avoid. He had faced battles, decisions, and royal responsibilities, but nothing had ever felt as heavy as this quiet struggle between breath and stillness. The palace staff moved softly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones. They brought warm blankets and cups of herbal remedies, hoping something would bring comfort. But nothing reached the emperor in the place where he now drifted, halfway between waking and fading. The silence wrapped around him, deepening each night until even the sound of his own breathing felt distant. Without music, the palace had become hollow, a vast shell filled with echoes. And then, one night, something shifted in the darkness. Far beyond the palace walls, the nightingale rested in the forest. It had healed slowly, finding comfort in the familiar breeze and the quiet strength of the trees. Yet the forest could not erase the memories it carried. The bird lived peacefully, but a part of its heart remained tied to the emperor. It remembered his pride, his desire, and his command for beauty. But it also remembered the moment he had listened, not to control, not to own, but simply to hear. That small memory lingered like a gentle echo. On the night when the emperor lay closest to the edge between life and death, the nightingale felt a pull in its heart, a soft, unexplainable tug. Something in the air felt wrong, heavy, and cold. The nightingale sensed the emperor's struggle without needing to see him. It lifted its wings and flew through the dark forest, guided by something deeper than memory alone. The path to the palace felt familiar, though it had been gone for a long time. When the nightingale reached the palace, it found a quiet window left slightly open. The bird slipped inside, its wings brushing against the still air of the emperor's chamber. Shadows clung to the walls. The emperor lay motionless beneath heavy blankets, barely breathing. The silence around him felt thick, as though the whole room waited for something. The nightingale landed near the foot of the bed. For a long moment, it simply watched. The emperor did not move. His face was pale, and his chest rose with slow, fragile breaths. The nightingale felt the darkness pressing toward him, inching closer with each passing heartbeat. Then the bird began to sing. The first note was soft and gentle, like a small light placed in a dark room. The sound reached the emperor's ears, pushing back the heavy silence. The shadows trembled at its touch. The nightingale's voice grew steadier, rising and falling with living warmth. It did not sing for admiration or praise. It sang because the emperor was alone, because the palace had forgotten what real music felt like, and because something deep inside the bird could not leave him to face the darkness unaccompanied. The melody filled the room slowly, brushing against the cold air and weaving through the shadows. With every note, the darkness loosened its grip on the emperor's chest. His breath softened, growing a little steadier. His fingers moved faintly beneath the blankets. His eyes opened only slightly, unfocused, but aware that the room was no longer empty. He could not move. He could not command. He could only listen. The nightingale's song wrapped around him gently, clearer and more comforting than he had ever remembered. The emperor felt the darkness step back inch by inch, replaced by the warmth of the living voice beside him. And the nightingale continued, carrying its song into the night, preparing the way for what was yet to come. The emperor awoke the next morning, with a weakness still clinging to his limbs. Yet the heavy shadow that had pressed over his chest for so many nights seemed lighter. It did not vanish completely, but it felt thinner, as if something had finally made room for breath again. When the light slowly crept through the tall windows and spread across the room, he realized he had not woken to silence. The faint memory of the nightingale's song hovered in his mind, soft and steady, like threads holding him together. It was the first morning in a long time that did not begin with fear or dread. He lay quietly, letting the fragile feelings settle inside him. The attendants entered as they always did, though now their steps were gentler, as if afraid that too much noise might shatter whatever miracle had occurred. They brought the usual warm cloths and medicines, but the emperor asked them to wait. He did not command them in the sharp tone he once used. Instead, his voice carried a softness shaped by exhaustion and clarity. Though they did not yet understand what had changed, they sensed that something unspoken was guiding him differently. As the day unfolded, the emperor found himself drifting between rest and thought. The palace continued its routines, though without the mechanical bird's presence. The halls seemed strangely bare. For years, The artificial nightingale had filled the grand chambers with its bright but shallow notes. Without them, the walls felt honest for the first time, quiet, cold, and empty. This emptiness might once have unsettled the emperor. But now it reminded him of the night. It reminded him of the living song that had come to him out of kindness, without orders or demands. The thought made him breathe a little easier. The nightingale did not return during the day. It stayed hidden among the branches of the forest, where the sun warmed the leaves and the small creatures moved softly around its resting place. The bird had never been a creature of schedules or royal expectations. It came when it chose and left when it wished. Yet as the sun fell behind the trees and a steady blue darkness spread across the sky, the nightingale felt the faint pull of the palace once again. Not a chain, not a command, but a memory. It lifted into the cooling air and flew a familiar path toward the emperor's window. When night settled fully, the emperor waited with a kind of quiet hope, though he did not allow himself the pride of certainty. He had learned enough humility in his illness to understand that a living creature owed him nothing. Still, when the soft flutter of wings reached the stillness of his chamber, he felt a warmth rise inside him. The nightingale perched near the window, letting moonlight rest on its feathers, and then its song began. It was gentler than the previous night, as if easing him slowly away from the edge he had hovered on for so long. Its music wound through the air with patience, never rushing, never showing off. It held a truth the emperor had never valued before: the beauty of something that came freely. Each night the bird returned, and each morning the emperor felt his strength quietly grow. His recovery was slow, shaped by rest and the steady presence of a comfort that did not belong to him but chose to visit. The attendants began to notice the change as well. They saw how the emperor's eyes brightened little by little, how his breaths became easier, how his hands trembled less. They spoke in whispers about the creature they sometimes glimpsed at the window, unsure whether it was real or part of the emperor's dreams. Yet the gentle mood that spread through the palace left no doubt that something living had touched the emperor's spirit. In time, the emperor began to walk again. He no longer demanded courtiers to entertain him or ordered spectacles to distract him. Instead, he moved slowly through the palace, noticing things he had never cared to see. The way the morning light lay across the floor, the soft rustle of tapestries when someone walked past, the muted sounds of servants tending to their work. He understood now that much of what he once considered beneath him was the very heart that kept the palace alive. The nightingale's song had shaken him out of the illusions he had built around himself, revealing a simpler, more truthful world. Word of his improvement spread quietly. Those who had once celebrated the mechanical bird now stopped to question what they valued. They had praised the jeweled imitation for its glitter and perfect repetition. But now many wondered how they had allowed themselves to forget the real nightingale. They realized how eagerly they had traded something alive for something polished. A kind of gentle shame touched the palace. People began to speak more softly, to look more closely at the world around them. The emperor's healing had become a kind of lesson they all absorbed. Yet the nightingale never asked for recognition or reward. It came in the quiet hours, sang for the emperor, and then disappeared into the darkness before dawn. Its song grew lighter as the emperor grew stronger, as if preparing him to stand without leaning too heavily on its gift. And the emperor understood this too. He did not try to keep the bird longer or make promises he could not uphold. He simply listened, night after night, with a gratitude that needed no words. Eventually, the emperor's strength returned enough for him to stand beside the window where the nightingale perched. He watched it in the moonlight, marveling at how small it was compared to the power it carried. He knew he could never repay the nightingale, nor should he try. What mattered was the understanding it had given him. Real beauty did not shine because someone demanded it, and true wonder could not be stored or controlled. The forest, meanwhile, welcomed the nightingale back each morning. The trees held its song in their branches, and the small creatures moved with a soft excitement whenever it returned from the palace. The nightingale belonged to them as much as it belonged to itself, and it carried no resentment for what had happened. The forest did not question why it flew to the emperor each night. It simply accepted the cycles of compassion that guided all living things. One night, as the emperor listened to the song that had once pulled him from the shadow of death, he felt a calm settle over him. It was different from the fragile peace of his early recovery. This was the calm of someone who understood something essential. When the nightingale finished its song and turned to leave, the emperor did not reach out or call for it to stay. He bowed his head slightly in respect, offering the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had learned how to see. The nightingale paused only a moment before lifting into the air. Its wings shimmered in the moonlight as it flew out into the open night. The emperor watched until it disappeared among the distant branches of the forest. He did not feel abandoned. He felt complete. From that day on, the emperor carried the nightingale's song inside him, not as a performance to display, not as a treasure to guard, but as a reminder that life was delicate and precious, a reminder that no jewel, no golden machine, no perfect imitation could ever replace something real, a reminder that beauty grew where freedom was allowed to breathe, and that gratitude was quieter but stronger than ownership. And though the palace continued to shine, it no longer chased the empty glitter of artificial wonders. Its people walked with a softer step. They listened more than they spoke. They looked towards the forest with respect rather than dismissal. The nightingale was seldom seen, but its presence shaped the kingdom in ways no one could measure. Each dawn it returned to the forest, its home, its refuge, its truth. And each night, somewhere deep in the palace, the emperor sat quietly, carrying in his heart the living memory of a song that had once saved his life. The story ended not with a celebration, but with understanding, not with possession, but with freedom, not with commands, but with gratitude. And so, the nightingale remained what it had always been, a fragile voice in a wide world, choosing to sing not because it belonged to anyone, but because it was alive.